Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to the Honest Youth Pastor YouTube channel, the channel that helps believers use biblical discernment in all aspects of life. And as you can probably tell by the thumbnail and title, this will be an interesting night. We are going to be talking about specifically feminism and the church, and who better to do that conversation than four dudes? I mean, why would we not have four dudes talking about feminism in the church, right? So,
we're white dudes.
does somebody want to throw cis in there? We already had this conversation. I should have just changed the title to Four White Cis Christian Men Talk About Feminism. Okay, there we go.
There's some male pattern.
I mean, we're the ones who cause feminism, right?
Perhaps. So we'll discuss that tonight. So as we sort of get into this conversation, I just feel like I have to use this sound bit right away.
How dare you?
Okay, so so now, before we get too far into this, I want to make sure that we define feminism off the bat, so we kind of know. Now, there's two definitions that are online. If you look them up, the very basic definition is the advocacy of women's rights on the basis of equality of the sexes, right? So that's the easy one. And then we have a more worked out basic definition, according to Google. And this one is where I think... I know me and Josh have watched it, but we'll kind of talk and sort of work this out. But this is the bigger definition that I think probably would be the definition that a lot of people would use. And it is, feminism is the interdisciplinary approach to issues of equality and equity based on gender expression, gender identity, sex, sexuality, as understood through social theories, and political activism. So we went from a very basic thing to then a very much built out thing. So that's fairly interesting that we went that far. So that being said, I threw out to the guys, in case you guys always watch this live. I'm sure everybody here or is rewatching it, watches it every single week, but we're not super planned out when we do these things. In fact, the next 2 weeks are the most planned out I've gotten on these, but I always text everybody out and I said, hey guys, you guys got any ideas of what you want to talk about? And Josh here, and this is where I'm just going to throw Josh under the bus again. Josh here said, hey, I think feminism in the church would be a good topic to talk about on the live stream. And I thought, well, who better to do that than me and Josh and Elijah? I mean, and Matt too, Matty V as well. I mean, probably the most qualified.
I don't have any feminism in my life though, so.
That's true. It's all patriarchy. That's a good point. It's all patriarchy. So, Josh, let's intro into this tonight. What sort of we kind of talked about what brought it up, but let's intro into it. So, like, what brought it up, and why do you think it's important to talk about? And we'll kind of go through the rest of us here, kind of working through.
Sure. Well, it was on my mind, partially because of going into Advent and things people were posting through Advent. Oh. So it was already kind of on my radar. But then I saw your post, your reel from the YouTube video about is Christianity for Weak Men. So I started watching that, and then you said, "Oh, that was a part, that popped in your feed." I think you mentioned in the video. It popped in my feed because I watched this thing on Vice, and I was like, I feel like these things can be fun to talk about. So why not discuss feminism with a bunch of dudes online tonight?
Yeah, sounds good. So let's go through it. I'm interested, Matt, because you attended a university that is known for probably very progressive thought in general. I know that I have a book that I have not cracked open yet called Black Liberal Feminism or Black Woman Liberal. I don't know. But anyway, I think it probably goes in the vein of a lot of what you probably heard at college. So like, or university rather. So like, do you see, just so, I mean, obviously jokes aside, four of us talking about it, yada, yada, yada. But the truth of it is online. The Vice panel is blowing up over YouTube. A lot of people have commented on it, done a whole review thing on all of it. Do you see that sort of in the university in sort of a cross section of Christianity, the church, and feminism as well? Like just from your experience.
Yeah, from my experience, I think that the validity of feminism, even in Christian circles of higher education, is just taken for granted. It's not questioned at all, and in many respects, they've moved beyond a feministic worldview, which has transformed into an even wider viewpoint that then is questioning gender identity and all of those things. So in those settings, to question something like feminist critiques of society or cultural or the patriarchy would be like, to them, it would be like in the field of medicine questioning the existence of germs. Like that, from their perspective, that's how redundant it would be to even bring it up and say, well, are you guys sure these feminist critiques are even valid in themselves? So I think it's beyond that. It's sort of the place they're in now is, you almost might say, is post feminism. Like you've moved from feminism that would be equivalent to modernity, and you moved into post modernity, which technically post modernity is a rejection of modernity. And so, in the same way that the place, at least in my experience, that feminism is that it's a rejection of classic feminism, because it's just taken for granted. It's taken as a part of the foundation from where they are now doing theological work.
Gotcha. So, I mean, as far as theological work, you're talking about specifically through the lens of feminism. So you're viewing a lot of theology through that lens specifically. Yeah. Okay.
Oh yeah, because like in chapel and everything, which I refused to go to unless it was absolutely required. It was all of the stuff about Mother God and everything like that. And for them, it wasn't this new thing to where it was flashy and that they were making a statement, but it was just taken as everyday language. Nobody thought about it twice. It was perfectly natural, perfectly at home, and it would have actually been offensive if those elements weren't included. So it's not like that they were intentionally trying to include those elements, but it would the offense would only come if those things were absent-mindedly left out, rather than offense coming from them intentionally being included.
Yeah. Well, and I think that there may be what's surprising to a lot of people, because, like, so for example, the latest sermon review I just did from Sunshine Cathedral, like, the only reason I found them is because some video they did for Christmas was on Twitter, and I thought, hey, this will be interesting. Let's go see a whole sermon from them. And a lot of the things that he mentioned from the pulpit were just like, that is crazy. Nobody says that. And then I found a video from 10 years before where the exact same things were being said. It's not like they were this was new to them. This was decades on as far as how they've already been doing that. So now, again, that's not every church. So Elijah, local church, maybe the churches in your area. I mean, have you seen, I don't know how long you've been in ministry. I probably should have asked you this long before now, but have you seen sort of the feminization or feminism sort of coming into church over time, or have you seen that at all, or kind of what's your on the ground in the trenches pastor experience?
Yeah, I mean, I've been a pastor about 18 years to answer that question. And it's really amped up the last few years from what I've seen. But it's infiltrated evangelical churches that were traditional and didn't have that kind of mindset before. And the church has always, it's not new that the church has dealt with the question of whether females should be clergy, should be elder or not. But it seems to be the point, those who don't believe in female elders, they, in the very least, are okay with someone else who believes in it and says, it's kind of a minor issue anyway. That seems to be much bigger now. And even in, I mean, I'm Baptist, I'm not a Southern Baptist, but like that question was dealt with or kind of argued out in the 80s. You didn't see it as big. And then especially in the 2000s, the Baptists were complementary. but then very recently, the past few years, it's like up for grabs again. So that's kind of my perspective. I don't know if we want to introduce that whole aspect of it, because that's not really feminism, but I think feminism has brought it to the evangelical church.
Yeah, well, and I think to that point, so in the video that Josh is referring to that I did a reaction to, the small clip that I did, there's a lady named Pearl. She happened to also be on that Vice panel, but the part she was in the reaction video, she was talking about how the church in general isn't a good place to find men because overall most churches are 70% female, and feminism has kind of entered into the church. And what I found interesting about that comment from her was that she doesn't claim to be a Christian. She doesn't even claim to go to church anymore, but that's her observation of the church from the time that she was in it, directly after she graduated college, which wasn't too long ago from what I understand. So the interesting thing was at least her observation, and it was sort of, the host, his name was Adam. He didn't seem like he had too much to interject on the feminism part. He had a whole lot more to say about the men part. But I think that it's very interesting from our different denominational backgrounds, our different educational backgrounds, kind of like to see like how far we've seen that go. So for me, like I said, that Sunshine Cathedral, I'm just like, what in the world is this dude calling God a she from the pulpit for? But for Matt, he's like, yeah, they did that in chapel every week. It's like, that's not a thing. Of course they were going to do that. And then, like you said, for you and probably Josh, the complementary thing has been a thing for a minute. So like, why would you even question it in the first place? So I think it's very interesting. Everybody's probably that's watching this video even, is entering it from a different sort of place, depending on where you are, probably regionally, probably what denomination you're backed in. And so it's very interesting. And one of the things that I would challenge a lot of people watching this, so every time we do bring up, for example, like you said, the women in pastoral positions is so low on the feminism poll as far as like the extremes that it can go. But when you even enter there, you can kind of see where people have really dug their heels in already at that point, and haven't necessarily, not everybody, just so you guys know, I'm looking right at the camera, okay? I'm not saying you haven't thought through it. I'm just saying a lot of people haven't thought through it. That's all I'm saying. I'm sure you've thought through it, but a lot of other people haven't, so just chill out. So the idea, though, is that a lot of people I don't think have thought through it. I, for example, grew up in the Wesleyan denomination. I'm still a Wesleyan, but like we didn't think twice about it. Like, of course there were women, like that's had been in Wesleyanism forever. And then I find out that wasn't everybody's deal. Like, no, not everybody did that. And I was like, what in the world is that about? I had to look into it. For some reason, they still haven't taken away my credentials. So if somebody wants to contact the Wesleyan Church, you might get my credentials taken away. So go for that. But the idea is, and just so you know, I've brought it up to them. I brought it up to them twice. I've said, hey guys, I'm not in line with this. So you do what you need to do. And they're still like, nah, we're fine. So whatever. But I think everybody's entering into this at a different position. And we really need to think through it, because I don't think, I want to pick your guys' brain on this comment. So when we're talking about feminism in the church, let's start at the first definition we talked about, which is just the advocacy of women's rights on the basis of equality of the sexes, right? I think, like, where do you stand on that? Because, I mean, there's like 5 waves of feminism. We're not going to get into all of them tonight, clearly. But on that definition in general, like, where are you on that definition? And we'll start with Josh and go around.
What was the definition again? Sorry.
The first one is the advocacy of women's rights on the basis of equality of the sexes. So basically rights and equality.
I mean, on its face, I think I'm fine with that. Like, on its face, I don't see an issue with that. In terms of equality and standing in general, or even before the law in the United States, where we live, or even biblically in terms of rights.
That's what I was going to say. I think it could stand up biblically as well. I mean, depending on which direction you go with it. But
right, and so that becomes, so we have a definition, we have a working definition, and it becomes problematic as people start to interpret it in different ways or stretch it, right? Because now we have to discuss, well, what does equality mean? That's a whole thing today, right? And equality leads into equity. And what do rights mean? Are we talking about positive rights or negative rights? And you start going down all these bunny trails trying to define everything to lay a foundation just for this simple understanding that, yeah, men and women have equal rights and standing, not even just in that regard, but before the Lord, right? We're equal before the Lord, right? We're saved by Jesus equally in the same manner. We're condemned sinners in the same manner. Like, there's a lot of equality in Scripture between men and women in that regard, generally speaking.
Yeah, no, that's a good call as far as definitions go. I have a feeling we'll have similar answers here. Matt, what do you think about that particular one, that definition?
So, yeah, I think that, let me start out this way. This might be a spicy way to kind of start it out, but I do think that differences in functional roles is not equivocal to differences in ontological equality. And I think that's where, we'll say, the conservative side draws the line, and the progressive side is not satisfied with that.
I think that's a very good Yeah, that's right on.
And that is where the validity of genders, like, you know, the idea of two genders begins to be questioned, because in order to eradicate any kind of functional difference between the genders, you can't have just male and female. You have to have more categories to be able to fill in this new framework that you've created. And so at an ontological level, or, you know, the value of the person, absolutely, male and female are equal. That's testified to in Genesis 1, because according to the account of Genesis 1, male and female, you know, God created male and female in his image. But then you get to specifically Genesis 3, after the narrative of the fall, and then you see those functional differences. And that's, again, not to say that those functional differences then create varying levels of inherent worth. It's just the way that two beings, two genders who are equally created in the image of God, are functioning with one another in relationship, especially within the context of a broken, fallen world.
No, I think that's good. Also, hold on, there's somebody at your door. You said the wrong thing, so now they're coming to get you. Okay, so Elisha, what do you think? I think, honestly, what you guys have kind of worked out already is awesome, but it also shows sort of where we're at in having to be like, oh man, we just can't do the simple definition, because now we have to work out all of the details of what that simple definition is. So Elijah, what's your I kind of put you behind the eight ball here with the other two in front of you, but what do you have in anything?
No, I mean, I'd say all of the above. I agree with what everyone has said. The one thing I like to emphasize, though, just to spice things up a bit, is that while there is equality, there was a gender that was created first, and Paul actually makes a deal out of that. That males were created before females. So in all your equality talk, you have to deal with that as well. So I just want to lob that out there. Not, there's my turn, and now I pass it. So.
Okay, well, and the interesting thing is that goes back again, connects to what Matt said in regards to the idea of, like, there is definitely a line there that anybody I've ever had that conversation with in regards to Paul, they're like, well, context. to his day. He was talking to his people. That's who he was talking to. So
okay.
what's interesting is that so even the simplest definition, I really think, shows where we really have to, as believers, I mean, like you said, really think through that and parse that out to even be clear about what we're talking about in regards to the local church. And part of that, I think, is probably because, to Pearl's point, that girl in the other video that's not a Christian, I think her observation is pretty correct in the fact that I think you have to do that because feminism has entered the church. And it's so... This second definition we're going to look at here, I think, has entered the church even in a small way, and therefore now you have to be very detailed about how you say things so that you're, quote unquote, clear on things. Now, the second one, if you guys want to watch the Vice panel, it's 45 minutes. It's very interesting if you want to see it. If nothing else, it'll kind of fill you in on where we're at culturally. But they would fit under this definition of feminism, which is what I read before, but I'll read it again real quick for you. Feminism is the interdisciplinary approach to issues of equality and equity based on gender, gender expression, gender identity, sex, and sexuality as understood through the social theories and political activism. What really sticks out to me there is a couple of things. One, obviously, for whatever reason that's not surprising to anymore, gender expression's in there. That would have surprised me a little bit ago. Not anymore. But what's really surprising is the political activism part it's baked into the definition. So if you are a feminist, now the expectation is, and you saw that if you were to watch the Vice panel, I'll put it in the description after we get done with this live so you can go watch it if you want. But what you will see is intersectionality just oozing out of the entire panel, in the sense of what I mean by that, in case you're unfamiliar with intersectionality, it's you can't just be a woman. You are now associated with your ethnicity. You're associated with any sort of second, like a disability, or you're associated with, in this case, they had dudes on the panel that identified as women. So now that's included, but that's part of the gender expression, gender identity. So now you're in a really murky territory to where your church, like if you're watching this, like your church may not be like, you're like, feminism's not in my church, but I'd be interested, like if you were to ask around, how many people would be cool or would be like, how many people in your church maybe think that how many people think that dudes that say they're women actually qualify as women? Like, it'd be very interesting to kind of pick their brains, because I think something that I've noticed, and maybe you guys have, and you can speak to this here in a minute as we talked about this definition, but one of the things I've noticed as I've had to watch a lot more videos for sermon reviews or just watching cultural commentary stuff is that a lot of people think things that I would have never thought they thought, right? Just growing up like in my little glass bubble where everything's super safe and I don't got to worry about it, and I'm out in the country and all I got's like woods, dogs, guns, hunting, and church, right? And so as soon as you see somebody that's like, no, that guy identifies as a woman, so he is a woman, you're like, you... Like, what is really? Like, that's what you think? And so I think that more so than we think, this definition is probably kind of seeped in. Clearly, it has through theological colleges. Clearly, it has within some churches. I mean, for example, that Sunside Cathedral has been around for 50 years. For the entire time it's been around, that is the doctrine and message they've been espousing. So it's not new. So with this definition here, I don't think I even have to ask if anybody agrees with this definition. I'll just make assumptions here. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but
Josh does.
Do I? Oh, okay. But
it's funny because on my screen I'm over here.
So. You guys are all over the place.
Well, I'm not pointing the right way. I don't. Wherever Josh is.
Yeah, the direction of your thermostat, but that could be backwards for you as well. But so I'm not sure. But so with this definition, like how do you? I guess here's the way to word the question: do you think that there are a lot of Christians? And I'll caveat with this, based on the fact that probably they haven't been catechized well, they haven't been discipled well. Culture's really been doing that part of the job for them. They've gone to church. They hear the messages, but really because of how engulfed a lot of churches are, a lot of Christians are in culture, do you think there's more Christians than we think? And this is all obviously just opinion here, but as far as churches and believers, do you think there's a lot of people that maybe believe this definition or would hold to that? Or let's put it this way, I think that demonstrates how feminism has probably gotten to the church that do believe it, but wouldn't want to admit to it, that they believe that.
I think there are plenty. And I think it boils down to, if you read that book that everyone loved a couple of years ago, Carl Trueman's book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, everybody is so big on you being able to identify what you are. I mean, that's Disney's whole message. So it's in our culture. And if they just follow the logic of what they actually think, you'll find people saying really crazy stuff. Like we have friends who grew up same situation as we were, very conservative, and they were just kind of saying, well, you know, shouldn't we just be nice and let people say whatever they want to say they are about themselves, you know, whether it's gender or anything, you know? So I think it's definitely there. I think it's ironic, just to back it up a bit, that all this comes from, this idea of politicizing everything comes from Marx. And then, you know, the Frankfurt School, critical theory, we have to have dead white Europeans who are males tell brown-skinned women, you know, how to think about themselves. And we have to use their language, dead white European males, to set up the problem. You know, until we got Kimberly Crenshaw is the one who wrote about intersectionality recently, but before then we're relying on dead white European males to define the lines in all this discussion.
Gotcha. Yeah, Josh or Matt, you guys have anything to add to sort of that definition and the acceptance maybe by the wider, not by the wider culture, because I think at this point that is a far gone conclusion that that's already accepted by almost everyone that's outside of the church. But what do you think about the church in general, as far as maybe that definition and the acceptance, but not wanting to say it? Because I think, let me caveat why I said that the way I did, maybe to clarify. I think the same thing happened with the LGBTQ plus movement in regards to the sort of the background acceptance that eventually just became just outright acceptance. And it seems to me that history is repeating in this regard, that like you see it enough in culture, and sort of what you just said, Elijah, like you just have people that are like, but it's there. Guys, you guys have any thoughts on that before I keep rambling on?
I mean, initially I was going to say no, that in my mind, I don't know anyone that would agree with general feminist theory or transgender identity and things like that in the church. And I was kind of thinking through, like, how many people do I really know well enough to say something like that? But I think the point that Elijah made was really pertinent in talking about like just the root of that idea existing, and it's just inundating us, right? Like we have Disney Plus, and I don't know, my kids have watched Encanto, and I'm sure it's buried in there somewhere. I have not watched all of Encanto to be able to speak in an educated manner in it, but it's probably in there. I've certainly seen it in a lot of Star Wars animations and whatnot. So I think it's important to take note that the idea is out there and it's been planted in us. It hasn't necessarily grown into full-blown, extreme feminist theory yet, but it could, because we're planting those seeds in our minds on a regular basis.
You're telling me you watched the whole Vice panel and you don't think it's grown into full feminism yet?
Well, within the church itself.
Oh, okay.
Right?
No, yeah, you're right. Yeah. Okay.
In the broader culture, but if we're going to deal specifically in the church world, and again, how do you dissect the church? Like, right, like you said, we're all from various different backgrounds, denominations with various doctrinal proclivities. But I think by and large, it may not have grown into that yet. But we could see that, just like you were just saying, like we saw with the LGBTQ plus situation, where it seems to have exploded out of nowhere, but that idea was there. Like, that didn't just come out of nowhere. And an explosion of feminism and transgender identity and men identifying as women and vice versa, that's not just coming out of nowhere. So if it does explode on the scene in a church or churches, it's not out of thin air, because nobody lives in a vacuum, especially a vacuum of ideas. Like, we're taking things in on a daily basis, and the roots of all of those ideas are in everything that we consume.
Yeah. Well, and what I find interesting in this, Matt, before I kind of shoot it over to you for your opinion on this, but with this definition, it has baked in the idea of transgenderism. Like, you can't get away from feminism, at least this wave of feminism. It has within it baked in transgenderism. And so the idea, and that's why, I mean, even with the question of the Christians in general kind of closets, sort of accepting it in the background before they just come out and say it in general, or really having to think through it. I mean, anytime I post about pronouns, the use of pronouns for Christians, I mean, it's like the stinking Red Sea over here. I mean, one side is completely, yeah, we don't do that, and the other side is completely okay. And it is continually surprising to me the mass division that happens when that goes out. Just of how many believers attach, well, kind of what you said, Elijah, like, well, just be like nice. Like, that's my way of, being nice. And I just think we haven't learned our lesson very well over the last 20 years in regards to just thing after thing coming up, and the nice thing always being the sort of that 1 foot out the door situation on that. But I think, because it's come up a lot, I just want to make sure everybody understands, like, with this definition, you can't avoid the transgender part of it. It's in the definition. So, Matt, you have any 2 cents before we kind of pivot to, I want to pivot to a different leg here, but you got anything on that definition and the acceptance of it?
Yeah, I guess I would say, just coming from being in the liberal progressive culture for a stint of time, it's only blaringly obvious from the outside looking in, and for them they're taking it for granted, as I said. So I guess that's one area. Then I think that there probably are individuals who actually, I would say there definitely are individuals who are in conservative circles who are personally of that persuasion. And I think they speak up maybe when and where they get the opportunity to, but just because of life circumstances or geography or family or whatever it may be, that they're still in the more conservative circles. And then I think that there are a lot of people within the church who take the, I guess you could say, I don't know, feminism that is already in the culture for granted as well, but they're not trying to press any more for it. They're okay with where we are generally and culturally, and we'll say, women's voting rights from the early 1900s, and pretty much, at least at this point, fairly equal job opportunities for either genders, depending on what the particular role may be. So yeah, I guess there that may be the 3 categories that I would say that are in the church. Although I guess there's also a question if the first group is technically in the church or not. in the visible church, maybe. Maybe not necessarily in the invisible one, though.
Yeah. Well, and on that point, if anybody has, I think Even Exile, the author of that book, I cannot remember her name, she does a really good job. She takes a whole chapter and kind of works through the waves of feminism, and part of like her conclusion is that there are some good things that have come from it in regards to imbalances, but overall it's not been a net positive. But she does, I think she did a really good job. I probably should have had that ready to talk about, but I don't. But it is about midway through the book, she kind of works through the history of feminism and then goes on the back end and has a conclusion as far as what she would say that was good and what was bad. But I want to pivot really quick. So we're talking about feminism in the church. I think that at this point we've pretty much got to the conclusion that it is in the church at large, maybe not specific churches, but I think to your point, Matt, there are parts of feminism, some could argue good or bad, but are just sort of here and have been accepted and already in the church in general. Egalitarian, as Elijah mentioned, is probably, I mean, again, lower on the totem pole, but it's there, and it's even being brought up in traditionally denominations that it wouldn't even be talked about in. All right, so you got your Southern Baptist and Beth Moore situation basically going on. And so even with that, it's affecting things still. So I want to talk about maybe something that, I mean, who's more qualified to talk about than us for, the negatives of, like, the negatives or effects, I suppose, of feminism in the church. Like, maybe that we've already seen, right? So there's obviously, if it's in the church, it's affecting things that are happening. Then if it's there, it's not just benign, right? It's not just like, it's, hey, I'm over here, don't worry about it though. Like, obviously things, if feminism is in the church, depending, again, what wave you're talking about of feminism, is in the church and it's present there and it's in the thought processes, clearly it's going to have an effect then. It's going to have some sort of downstream consequence for that happening. I'm going to ask you, I'll go first so you guys have time to kind of think about this. I'm not putting anybody on the spot, but what have you maybe seen locally in your local church, or maybe just in your local sort of circles, that you can go, oh yeah, I can see that being an effect of that. Now again, like I've already said, I'm part of the Wesleyan denomination, so we already have a lot of female pastors. But what's interesting is, depending on where you're at, that's not like, so where I'm at is a fairly conservative area in regards to even Wesleyan. So there's no female, well, incorrect. There's one. But in general, it's just kind of like, it's kind of what Matt said. Like, we don't talk about it, but we don't like it, but it's there. It's the general sense of what I've gotten from the pastors I've talked to. But the downstream effect, I think, is something that Pearl had mentioned in that interview that I reacted to, is that when you have feminism in the church in general, you have 70% women basically make up the makeup of the church. That, of course, affects programs. That, of course, affects how things are organized. That, of course, affects, the sort of things that are talked about, or the how they're talked about, or what even happens. So what you do have, and in case you guys haven't seen that reaction video you guys are watching, Adam's point in it is that, like, why would a guy go to church if the guys that he's seen go to church appear to be weak dudes that need help for that week to get through life, was his exact quote. And so he looks at that and goes, hey, if the church is 70% female and the dudes that are there are just obviously guys that need some psychological help, why would I show up? And I have to say, even though I think his approach is totally wrong, I think the underlying assumption there is right. There's a lot of guys that I know that won't go to church because they're like, why would I go hear, my mom or grandma talk for an hour? Like, I can do that at home. I think that was the appeal. For example, I think that was the wide appeal of why Mark Driscoll had such the impact that he did have, because the dude was just said whatever he wanted and guys related to it. And so there's clearly an impact of feminism in the church. Again, people could argue good or bad. But the idea being that they're just like, why would I go? And I think by and large, what's really interesting, because I like, if it paid any money, I'd like to be like whatever the technical term for watching people is and like documenting what they do. I know there's a term for that. I just can't remember what it is. But as I've done that, I have seen, like, depending on what speaker is speaking at an event or what pastor is preaching, there will be dudes that I know that will deliberately show up or deliberately not show up. Because they're like, why would I, again, no one's outright said it, but the general gist has been, why would I go? I'm not interested at all what that person's saying. Whether that be a guy that they just don't feel like has anything to offer them, or whether that be a lady that they're just like, I just don't care. And people can call that sexist and misogynistic. They can call it whatever they want, but the point is there is implication and there's a reason why that's happening. So that's what I've seen personally. For example, the Mark Driscoll thing is a really personal impact for me. That was when I was in college, that I heard that dude talk and I thought, I have never heard a guy talk like this before. I've never heard a pastor be this intense before. But again, no offense to most of the pastors I grew up with, but they weren't that bold in their proclamation of the gospel. They were preaching to a bunch of grandmas, so they kept it down because Driscoll preaching to a bunch of grandmas isn't going to keep the grandmas there. So, Josh, what do you think?
Yeah, I relate to what you're saying about old Mark Driscoll. I kind of knew who he was in the early 2000s, and then when I got home from Iraq, he appealed to me quite a bit just because of how he said things, of his tone, how he carried himself, and whatnot. I think so. For me, just speaking personally, I think that the overall impact of feminism in the church for me wasn't so much necessarily this domineering of women taking charge of everything and running things, but it came in, and we did see women taking over more positions of leadership in the church in terms of running general ministries, and dudes being okay with that. And it's not to say that that's necessarily wrong on its face, but it is to say that it allowed men to be lazy and not fulfill certain roles as men, like being in charge of something or helping lead something and being leaders in the church. And if you were to go and look at an average church, by and large, most men aren't leading as many of the ministries at time. Like, I feel like I'm painting with a broad brush here, right? I can't speak to every church in every situation, but that seems to be the case. And I know it was for me growing up. That was what was always emphasized, was that I needed to be tender and to be nice, because I have that tendency towards being what's called toxic masculinity today, right? Where every stick was a gun or a weapon sort when I was playing with it, right? And it still is to me. So it was this idea that men had to be toned down to be more like women, right? You had to be emasculated, and you have to chill out. You have to be nice, right? That's that big Christian catchphrase that has no actual meaning. And I think that's been the big impact, at least in my experience, was this idea of bringing and toning men down and making them nicer and more effeminate. And then as that plays out, your children are that way as well, and you start to see this flaccid youth come about that can't stand for anything, that don't have a backbone, that can't, like Jordan Peterson says, they can't stand up straight and put their shoulders back and say something. And you see the rise of people. So we see the downfall of Mark Driscoll, but then you see the rise of people like Jordan Peterson and others like him, who are becoming examples to youth, but they're not believers. And I like what Jordan says, and I agree with a lot of it, but he's not a believer. And you have to be really careful in how you handle some of these things, because he's not necessarily originating from the same starting point of truth that we would. So we need Christian Jordan Petersons, but nobody likes Doug Wilson. So,
well, and I like what you say there, because there is this very prominent bro culture, like manliness culture, that's sort of come up because there's a vacuum there to fill. But like what you said, there's no Christian, there's not a lot of Christian men to fill that, because as soon as you do, it's not quote unquote Christ-like. But the interesting part is there's clearly a vacuum for it. And I think where correct criticism is that I think people, like the Andrew Tates of the world, go way too far, because there's not that biblical gospel message that then, as Paul talks about, tones it back to where now you serve as Christ in that relationship. So you serve and you sacrifice. That's totally out of the window for them. So there's this vacuum here of like, this is needed, and people know it's needed, but there's not the stopgap of the gospel there to then cage that in a good biblical manner. So then all of a sudden it's like guys were like, well, I have to choose this, being not like just being okay, sit here and be quiet, or be Andrew Tate. Like, so which direction am I going to go? And there's nothing there. So good point. I love it. Matt, what about you?
Yeah, I guess my major criticism or complaint about feminism is sort of I might either say a methodological one or a practical one, because if feminism is either the complaint or the reaction against either the failures of men or the overreach of men or the abuse of men, then where is the answer, and how do we get to any kind of a solution, either from the macro view as a culture, or the micro view at the level of the family, because I think that it even goes beyond just the local church and extends into the nuclear family, with the roles of the father. And so my question to feminism is, what is the solution? Because it seems to me, and I don't like to be totally wrong, but it seems to me that it's a lot of it's a lot of complaints without a lot of solutions, and the solutions that men try to offer normally aren't enough, or seems to be exactly the opposite of what feminism is seeking for. And I think that if there is going to be any sort of cultural change and cultural shift, it does begin in the home. There is that influence, and it should absolutely come from the local church, because the elders, the pastor, whatever the ecclesiological structure is that you have there, they should be setting up that example for the man. But it does have to be done in the home, and I think that for some men, they tend to go to the extreme and become over dominant and over domineering. And so being over dominant is going to cause the same problems, if not worse problems, than a man who is, to use Paul's term, moskoi, or soft, effeminate, as we might say. So I think that both aspects cause problems, but I think that the men who do go to the extreme, and who will say beat their wives and beat their children, and just tell their wives to shut up in conversation in front of other people, and dog them and make fun of them and insult them in front of their family, in front of their friends, out in public, or they go to work and they just complain about their wife constantly. Like for me, I think that's more of a problem even than the men who are absent, or who are passive. Both are problems. And so I don't think that whatever answers that feminism is offering will be good enough, because I think that's one of the reasons why there have been waves of feminism, because one wave crashes against the shore and it's not far enough to accomplish what they originally set out to do. So in comes another wave, and it goes farther up on the shore. And then once that wave sort of runs out of momentum, they're like, well, we're still not there. There's still no solution. And at what point does it stop before it's just an entire tsunami and destroys the coastline, and there is no more beach for the waves to come in on? And there have been cycles and circles of this kind of cultural advances in this thing, and even in the church, you have guys like even as early as Tertullian, and later in Jerome, who actually write about women in the church doing and saying the same things that we see in the present. I just think that we often look at the very near past through rose-colored glasses, and it's like, our grandparents, or at least 10 years ago, 20 years ago, is always seen as our own golden era, and like we fail to see the larger picture of these things. And it's the same thing that the preacher says in Ecclesiastes. There really is nothing new under the sun. It just comes back in new waves with new faces. I mean, even transgenderism. There was the cult of Kubele or Sabel, or however you want to pronounce it, depending on what language you're in, and that was a cult of transgenders, and that's something that the church had to deal with and had to address, and they did, obviously, because I mean, eventually, I mean, of course, cultural Christianity eventually fell itself through Constantinianism and such. But I mean, they did address it. It did kind of go away for almost 1900 years or so. So
I love that you brought that up. So today when I was researching feminism, that actually, I hadn't got that far in our church history class yet, but that came up in kind of looking over feminism in preparation for this. And I thought, man, like you said, it's just repetition. And it's not like the church hasn't dealt with this before. It's not like the church hasn't answered these questions before. It's just, like you said, I think for us, it's just so surprising that we're just like, oh, well, we got, we're going to answer it this way or that way. And you're like, they already talked about it, guys. Like, you just don't know they talked about it. Like, they've already done this. We've already had this conversation.
And I will give you an example of a way that it should not be addressed. And I think that Augustine dealt with it the wrong way. Because this is something that Augustine had to say, and also Augustine, like, he wouldn't even be around a woman. Like, if there was a woman around, he would turn and leave, and a part of that is because he came out of a Manichaean lifestyle in which he indulged in anything and everything that he wanted. He lived like an animal and just followed his appetite, and so he was probably trying to rein that in certain ways. But it got to the point when he's writing on Genesis 9, he says, and this does not reflect the views of myself or Honest Youth Pastor for anybody who's reading, and this may not reflect all of Augustine's life and views. Things may have changed. It may have been a bad sort at this point, but he says, I don't see what sort of help woman was created to provide for man with, if one excludes the purpose of procreation. For if woman is not given to man for help in bearing children, what help does she have to offer? Can she till the earth with the man? If help were needed for that, a man would have been a better help for a man. And the same goes for comfort when you are lonely. How much more pleasure is it for life and conversation when two male friends live together than when a man and a woman cohabitate?
Sounds like that bro had some bad relationships. Like, he was just like a little, yeah, he was. It's a good reminder to not practice your theology through necessarily your life circumstances. It's not the best thing to do. Yeah. Yeah. But no, I like bringing all that up. I think that's great. Not only the fact that the early church addressed transgenderism, but the fact that, I mean, Paul in the Roman Empire, it wasn't some random thing that he was dealing. I mean, when he sends these letters out, he's dealing with all kinds of sexual sins, all kinds of promiscuity and things that he's dealing with. And so that's why still authoritative, still helpful. So, all right. So Elijah, wrap us up here. What do you think as far as the implications you've seen? And then I like how you guys already jumped the gun for me, because I didn't know how we were going to fit it in, but not only the implications you've seen, but the correction and how you think maybe we can kind of wrap around and to fix this in a biblical way, because I think everything we've said so far has been great. Looking forward to what you got.
Well, coming from my Baptist tradition, I think one of the biggest evils we face is we're big on what are called potluck dinners, and the influence of feminism with that. I wonder who's going to make the sandwiches. We were 55 minutes in and no one had made a sandwich. I just had to.
I mean, that really got out of hand fast.
Also, Elijah's views do not necessarily represent the Honest Youth Pastor.
Amazing.
I would just recommend a book by Nancy Pearcey, Love Thy Body. I don't know if you've ever talked about it on the show before or not, but what I love, she in that book gives some positive solutions that I think are actually, they're pro-woman. They're not feminist under any way that term is defined much, but maybe by her first definition, but she makes suggestions like, why do we have to assume that the way men do jobs is the way to fulfill your vocation? Why can't there be a 20-hour work week where you're also a mother and you also do something amazing because you're brilliant, like Nancy Pearcey is, and you have a doctorate? Why can't children be in a workplace? They used to not be in a workplace because of the Industrial Revolution, and it was dangerous. Why is the epitome of a woman being equal her working in a work week that looks like something a man did in the 1950s? 9 to 5, 40 hours. That's the epitome of success. If we really want to value women, why define success in a woman to look like a man? If we want true equality, why not honor a woman for what she can do? And why not build workarounds around that? And I think we as a church could do that. Mm-hmm. We could have, I don't know what, we could have women come sit in our church and have their kids there and do graphic designing or writing books or just huge things, running a business. And their kids can be there and they can be welcomed. And women don't have to work a miserable 9 to 5 workaholic job and be equal to man. Why don't we honor women for whom God has made them? So.
No, got it. Good deal. So I think what we've sort of wrap everything up here before we wrap it up, right? That feminism is a reality in the culture, clearly. Definitely by the definition of the second one we talked about in regards to gender expression, gender identity, sexuality is understood through social theories. So all of this is, defined by the society we live in now currently. And it's there, and it's definitely, I think I would agree that it's in the church in some form or fashion, again. And then really, I think for all of us watching this or, when you're watching it later, thinking through what are the implications of that then? And most importantly, as all three of you guys have mentioned, like, do they line up biblically? I think, Matt, your point was really good in regards to, I think, one of the things that happens is you'll go from one extreme to then the other extreme because you see, oh, well, we don't want this down here, this guy doing nothing and just sitting there like, so we'll have him be super masculine dude. And then he does, everything and tells you to shut up and tells you when to sit down. And that is obviously also not the biblical way. We have a very clear picture and a very, as my egalitarian friends point out all the time, we see women taking active roles in the New Testament, which, in case you're unfamiliar with Roman culture, in general, a lot of things that Paul's talking about in both men and female relationships is a little radical for the day. So it's one of those things where the church is really a conduit of saying, hey, like you just said, like you have like these gifts and these abilities. How can we utilize them well for you? How can we help you utilize them well? And men, you're like, to Josh's point earlier, like you're supposed to step up and do something. Just because somebody says, don't worry, I'll get it, doesn't mean you can just sit down and be like, oh, well, they got it. Right. Like there's this idea of responsibility amongst both genders and saying, okay, this is how the Bible has laid this out. This is how we then operate in them. And there is this understanding of complementary, again, there's going to be people who disagree with this, but there's this understanding of complementarianism, of equal with different roles. And these roles are beautiful and good. Like the book you recommended, I think people should probably check that out, but also Even Exile, I think she does a great job of laying that out. And really, you read that book, I don't see how you could read that book as a woman and think, well, she's trying to, tell me I shouldn't do anything. The whole book is filled with you're actually not fulfilling all the potential you should be fulfilling. And the idea is like, there's all of these roles and men are either sitting back and not doing the thing they're supposed to do. And then women are trying to be the men that they were never meant to be. And the church is suffering because of it, because in general, we've just accepted the cultural definition of what's supposed to happen. And we're trying to make that work within the four walls of the church where it was never meant to, it's not meant to work there because that's not how the gospel lays it out. That's not how gospel relationships look and how they work. So understanding the scriptures, reading the Bible, saying, what does this mean and how are we supposed to live it out? an understanding that is authoritative, right? This isn't Paul going, well, in my day, you did this, but rather saying, no, this is the way that the church is supposed to operate and supposed to function well. And unfortunately, I mean, I'm sure there's people that could point out a number of examples of where that hasn't functioned well because something has fallen out of place. The guy's got too heavy-handed when he shouldn't have been, or too lackadaisical when he shouldn't have been, and things go off the rail either way when that happens. So that being said, hopefully, guys, if you liked this, if you're still here, if you made it through the whole thing, go ahead and hit that like button, and make sure if you're not subscribed, you do subscribe. And next week, I just want to let you know, we're going to have Paul from Paul and Morgan on. We're going to be talking about Christian relationships, just Christian relationships in general. We'll be covering that topic. That's a lot of what him and Morgan talk about on their channel. So he's coming over here and doing that with us next week as well. So a little similar, but not quite as similar. So look forward to that next week. Thank you guys for tuning in. Thank you guys, as always, for joining, and we'll see you later. Bye.